Every morning, before anything real has even happened, your mind is already moving, replaying, anticipating, holding on to things that haven't even touched reality yet. And without noticing it, you're already carrying weight that doesn't belong to this moment. It feels normal, responsible even, but most of what exhausts you was never required of you in the first place. The Stoics understood this deeply. Marcus Aurelius observed that the mind turns simple things into burdens, not because life is heavy, but because we grip everything too tightly. You try to control outcomes, manage perceptions, prepare for everything, but the tighter you hold, the more unstable everything feels. And somewhere in that effort, peace quietly disappears. There's a different way to live. You still care, but not in a way that drains you. You still act, but without the constant tension beneath it. And the moment you begin to see that clearly, even slightly, something starts to shift. Not outside you, but within you. You've probably noticed how quickly your mind attaches itself to things. A small comment becomes hours of overthinking. A delay turns into a story about failure. Someone's tone starts to feel like a judgment of your worth. It happens fast, so fast you don't even see the moment it begins. 1 second, something neutral happens. The next, your mind has already built a story around it. Layered, emotional, personal. And most of the time, it isn't even real. This pattern isn't about importance, it's about conditioning. Your mind has learned to treat everything as urgent, everything as meaningful, everything as something that requires a reaction. It doesn't filter, it reacts. A passing remark feels like criticism. A small inconvenience feels like a threat. And because it feels automatic, it feels true. But when everything feels important, nothing is filtered. And when nothing is filtered, everything becomes heavy. You carry that weight into everything. Conversations, decisions, even quiet moments. It shows up as tension, as restlessness, as a constant mental noise that never really stops. And after a while, you stop questioning it. You assume this is just how life feels, but it isn't. Most of that weight isn't coming from reality. It's coming from how your mind is interacting with it, and this is where something begins to shift. The moment you start observing your thoughts instead of following them, you create space. You begin to see the difference between what happens and what your mind adds to it. That space is small, but it changes everything. Because now, not every thought feels convincing. Not every interpretation feels true. You start to notice that some thoughts don't deserve your agreement. That's where clarity begins. As Marcus Aurelius put it, you have power over your mind, not outside events. And that realization shifts your focus completely, not toward controlling life, but toward understanding your response to it. Because most moments don't need a reaction. They pass on their own, quietly and naturally. But the mind doesn't let them pass. It holds, replays, analyzes, and over time, that becomes exhausting. So the shift isn't about resisting your thoughts. It's about noticing them, catching the moment when a simple event becomes a complex story, and pausing. That pause is small, but it interrupts everything. It gives you just enough distance to choose differently. At first, that choice isn't easy. The pull of old habits is strong. The urge to analyze, to personalize, to react, it feels automatic. But with awareness, something changes. You begin to see that not everything needs your involvement. Some things can exist without becoming something bigger. Some thoughts can appear and simply pass. And as that awareness grows, the weight begins to lift. Not because life becomes easier, but because you stop making it heavier than it is. If this way of seeing things is starting to make sense to you, then stay with it. And if you want to keep building this kind of clarity, this kind of control over your own mind, then consider subscribing. Not just as a habit, but as a decision to keep removing what doesn't serve you, and to keep moving toward a mind that's calmer, clearer, and harder to disturb. Now consider this more carefully. because it's easy to miss. The weight you feel throughout the day doesn't always come from what's happening around you. It often comes from how you're holding on to what's happening. There's a subtle tension in the way most people move through life. A constant tightening, a quiet effort to control outcomes, to prevent mistakes, to make sure nothing goes wrong. It feels like responsibility. It feels like awareness. But underneath that, there's strain. And over time, that strain becomes exhausting. You can see it in small moments, waiting for a response that hasn't come yet and feeling your thoughts spiral. Trying to make sure a conversation goes perfectly, replaying every word in your head, holding on to an expectation so tightly that even a slight deviation feels like something is breaking. These moments seem different on the surface, but they share the same pattern. It's not the situation creating the pressure, it's the grip you have on it. Think of holding something delicate in your hands. The instinct is to grip it tightly, to make sure it doesn't fall. But the tighter you hold it, the more your hands shake, the more your muscles tense, the more unnatural your movements become. The very act of trying to protect it begins to make you unstable. But when you loosen your grip just enough, something shifts. Your movements become smoother. Your body relaxes. You're still holding it, but you're no longer fighting it. Life works in a similar way. Most of the tension you feel isn't coming from what you're carrying, but from how rigidly you're trying to carry it. You hold on to outcomes as if they must happen a certain way. You hold on to people as if their behavior must align with your expectations. You hold on to plans as if deviation means failure. And in doing so, you create a constant internal pressure that has nothing to do with reality itself. The Stoics understood this in a way that still feels almost counterintuitive. Epictetus expressed it simply: make the best use of what is in your power and take the rest as it happens. There's a quiet strength in that idea, not passive acceptance, but a shift in where you place your effort. Instead of trying to control everything, you focus only on what is actually yours to influence, and everything else is allowed to unfold without resistance. At first, this feels uncomfortable. Letting go of that tight grip can feel like losing control. There's a sense that if you don't hold on as firmly, things might fall apart. But if you look closely at your experience, you start to notice something. Most things were never fully under your control to begin with. The outcome of a situation, the reaction of another person, the timing of events, these have always existed outside your reach. The only difference is that now you're no longer exhausting yourself trying to manage them. As that realization settles in, your relationship to situations begins to change. The same circumstances are still there, the same uncertainties, the same variables, the same unpredictability, but your internal state starts to feel different. There's less tension, less urgency, less need to force things into place. You begin to move through situations instead of pushing against them, and that shift, while subtle, has a profound effect on how everything feels. This doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you care differently. You still show up, you still put in effort, you still act with intention, but you're no longer tying your sense of stability to outcomes that you can't guarantee. You're no longer gripping so tightly that every small change feels like a threat. Instead, there's a kind of flexibility that begins to emerge. A quiet confidence that doesn't depend on everything going perfectly. Over time, this way of approaching life starts to feel more natural. You notice that situations which once felt overwhelming now pass with less resistance. Delays don't carry the same weight. Uncertainty doesn't trigger the same level of tension. Even setbacks begin to feel different, not because they're pleasant, but because they no longer define your state of mind in the same way. There's a kind of freedom in that, not the kind that comes from controlling everything, but the kind that comes from no longer needing to. You begin to trust that you can handle what arises without preemptively tightening around it. You begin to see that your strength doesn't come from holding on harder, but from knowing when to loosen your grip. And as that becomes clearer, something else follows. You start to experience moments more directly, without the constant layer of tension sitting on top of them. Conversations feel lighter, decisions feel clearer, even challenges feel more manageable because you're no longer adding unnecessary pressure to them. In the end, nothing external has fundamentally changed. The same world, the same unpredictability, the same flow of events continues. But internally, something is different. The weight that once felt constant begins to lift. Not because life has become easier, but because you're no longer holding it in a way that makes it heavy. And that small shift in how you relate to things quietly changes everything. This is where things often get misunderstood, and that misunderstanding keeps people stuck longer than they need to be. The idea of caring less immediately sounds like withdrawal, like a loss of passion, like stepping away from life instead of engaging with it. It gets interpreted as coldness, as indifference, as a kind of emotional shutdown. And because of that, most people reject it before they even begin to understand what it actually means. They assume that if they loosen their grip, they'll lose their drive, their relationships, their sense of purpose. But the reality is almost the opposite. Caring less, in the way it's meant here, isn't about reducing your involvement. It's about refining it. It's about removing the unnecessary emotional weight that comes from trying to control what was never yours to control. You still show up fully. You still pursue what matters to you. You still invest your time and energy into meaningful things. But you stop tying your inner stability to outcomes that are uncertain by nature. You stop measuring your worth by how things turn out, and that shift changes the quality of everything you do. The confusion comes from equating attachment with care. People believe that the more attached they are to an outcome, the more they care about it. But attachment isn't the same as commitment. Attachment is rigid. It demands a specific result. It resists change. It creates tension because it's constantly trying to force reality into a particular shape. Commitment, on the other hand, is steady. It focuses on effort, on intention, on showing up consistently, regardless of how things unfold. And when you begin to separate those two, you start to see how much unnecessary pressure you've been carrying. You can notice this in moments where things don't go as planned. When you're deeply attached, even a small deviation can feel like a major disruption. Your mood shifts, your thoughts spiral. You start questioning everything. But when you're committed without attachment, the same situation feels different. You adjust, you respond, you move forward without turning the moment into something bigger than it needs to be. The external situation hasn't changed, but your internal experience of it has. This is where the Stoic perspective becomes practical rather than abstract. Epictetus expressed it clearly. Some things are up to us and some things are not. It sounds simple, almost obvious, but living it requires a level of awareness that most people don't develop. Because in daily life, that line gets blurred constantly. You start treating other people's opinions as if they're within your control. You treat timing, outcomes, and external circumstances as if your effort alone should determine them. And when reality doesn't align with that belief, frustration follows. The shift begins when you start to draw that line more clearly. You recognize what actually belongs to you, your actions, your decisions, your responses, and you begin to release what doesn't, other people's reactions, unpredictable outcomes, the countless variables that exist outside your influence. This doesn't mean you stop caring about those things entirely. It means you stop letting them dictate your internal state. You engage where you can, and you let go where you can't. At first, this can feel like a loss of control, but over time, it reveals itself as a different kind of control. Not control over events, but control over yourself. And that form of control is far more stable, because it doesn't depend on things going a certain way. It doesn't collapse when something unexpected happens. It remains steady even when circumstances shift. As this becomes more natural, your energy starts to concentrate. Instead of being spread thin across everything, It becomes focused on what actually matters. You put more effort into your work, not because you're anxious about the result, but because you're fully present in the process. You invest in relationships, not because you're trying to secure a certain response, but because you value the connection itself. And in doing so, the quality of your actions improves. There's also a quiet confidence that begins to develop, not the kind that comes from guaranteed success, but the kind that comes from knowing you can handle whatever happens, because you're no longer tying your sense of stability to things you can't control. You're no longer building your peace on something unstable. Instead, you're grounding it in something consistent, your own ability to respond with clarity. This way of moving through life doesn't remove challenges. It doesn't eliminate uncertainty, but it changes how those things affect you. They stop feeling like threats to your identity or your sense of worth. They become situations to navigate rather than problems to resist. And that shift reduces a significant amount of unnecessary stress. Over time, you begin to see that caring less, in this sense, isn't a loss at all. It's a refinement. You're not reducing your engagement with life. You're removing the parts of that engagement that were draining you. You're keeping what matters and letting go of what doesn't. And as that balance becomes clearer, you start to experience a kind of steadiness that doesn't depend on everything going right. That steadiness becomes the foundation for everything else. It allows you to act without hesitation, to care without fear, to move forward without constantly looking over your shoulder. And in that space, you begin to understand something that isn't immediately obvious at the start. The less you care about what you can't control, the more effectively you can care about what you can. What makes this so difficult isn't a lack of understanding. On some level, you already know that holding on to everything isn't helping you. You've felt the tension. You've seen how your thoughts can spiral beyond what the situation actually requires. And yet, even with that awareness, the pattern keeps repeating. The mind returns to the same loops, the same worries, the same attempts to anticipate what might go wrong. It feels automatic, almost like something you don't fully control. And in many ways, that's because it has been trained to operate this way over time. Your mind has taken on the role of a protector, but not in the way you might expect. It believes its job is to constantly scan for problems, to stay one step ahead of anything that could disrupt your sense of stability. It looks for risks, for uncertainties, for anything that might go wrong, and it tries to prepare you by running through scenarios in advance. At first glance, this seems useful. It feels like awareness. It feels like responsibility. But there's a difference between being aware of potential challenges and being consumed by them before they even exist. That distinction is where most of the unnecessary weight begins. Because the mind doesn't always stop at awareness. It moves into repetition. It takes a single possibility and replays it in different forms, adding detail, adding emotion, making it feel more real with each pass. And as it does this, your body responds as if the situation is already happening. Your heart rate shifts, your muscles tighten, your attention narrows. You're no longer simply thinking about something that could happen. You're experiencing it as if it already has. And this is where the problem becomes clear. If worrying truly improved outcomes, if it genuinely prepared you in a meaningful way, then the cost might be justified. But when you look closely at your own experience, you start to see a different pattern. Most of what you worry about never unfolds in the way you imagined. The scenarios your mind constructs rarely match reality. And even when challenges do arise, they often come in forms you didn't anticipate at all. So what then is the function of all that mental effort? It doesn't eliminate uncertainty. It doesn't guarantee better results. What it does, more often than not, is drain your energy in advance. It takes moments that could have been calm, neutral, or even enjoyable, and fills them with tension. It pulls you out of the present and places you in a version of the future that doesn't exist yet. And in doing so, It makes life feel heavier than it actually is. There's a line from Seneca that captures this precisely. We suffer more often in imagination than in reality. It's a simple observation, but it points directly to what's happening beneath the surface. The mind, in its attempt to protect you, ends up creating a form of suffering that is entirely self-generated, not because it intends to harm you, but because it hasn't learned to distinguish between useful preparation and unnecessary repetition. This doesn't mean the mind is an enemy. It means it's a tool that has developed habits. And like any habit, it continues unless it's brought into awareness. The goal isn't to stop thinking about the future entirely. Planning, reflecting, considering possibilities, these are all useful when done intentionally. The issue arises when those processes become automatic, when they run without direction, when they continue long after they've served any practical purpose. You can begin to notice this in your own experience. There's a point where thinking shifts from being helpful to being repetitive, a point where you're no longer gaining insight, but simply circling the same thoughts again and again. And when you reach that point, continuing to engage with those thoughts doesn't bring clarity. It brings fatigue. It creates a sense of urgency without resolution. This is where a subtle shift can begin. Instead of trying to force your thoughts to stop, you start to recognize when they've stopped being useful. You see the pattern as it unfolds. You notice when your mind is replaying something that doesn't need to be replayed. And in that moment, you have the option to step back, not by resisting the thought, but by not feeding it further. At first, this feels unnatural. The impulse to continue thinking, to keep analyzing, to search for some kind of certainty can be strong. But as you practice stepping away from that impulse, even briefly, you start to experience something different. A moment of quiet, a small release of tension, and over time, those moments begin to expand. As they do, your relationship with your thoughts changes. You begin to see them not as commands that must be followed, but as signals that can be observed. Some of them are useful, worth engaging with. Others are simply noise, repeating out of habit. And the more clearly you can see the difference, the less power those unnecessary thoughts have over you. This doesn't eliminate uncertainty from your life. It doesn't remove challenges or unpredictability, but it changes how those things affect you. Instead of experiencing them twice, once in imagination and once in reality, you begin to meet them only when they actually arrive, and that alone reduces a significant amount of unnecessary strain. In that space, something important becomes clear. Your mind doesn't need to solve everything in advance for you to be capable of handling what comes. It doesn't need to anticipate every possible outcome for you to respond effectively. In fact, the more you allow things to unfold without constant interference, the more present and adaptable you become. And that presence is where real clarity exists. Not in endless anticipation, not in constant mental rehearsal, but in the ability to meet each moment as it is, without adding layers that don't belong. The mind may continue to suggest that worry is necessary, that it's helping, that it's keeping you safe. But with awareness, you begin to see through that illusion. And once you do, the need to carry that constant mental burden starts to fade. And this is where something subtle begins to shift, almost quietly at first, but with a depth that becomes impossible to ignore once you notice it. The moment you stop automatically agreeing with every thought that enters your mind, something changes in your relationship with yourself. Instead of being pulled instantly into reactions, into emotions, into interpretations, you begin to see them as they are. Movements within the mind, not commands that must be followed. That alone creates space. And in that space, something new becomes possible. It doesn't happen in a dramatic way. There's no sudden transformation, no instant clarity that solves everything at once. It starts small. A moment where a thought appears, and instead of immediately believing it, you hesitate. You don't push it away, but you also don't lean into it. You simply notice it. And that act of noticing, simple as it seems, interrupts a pattern that may have been running for years without question. That interruption is where distance begins to form. Not distance from your life, not from your responsibilities or your experiences, but from the automatic suffering that comes from reacting without awareness. Because most of what exhausts you isn't what happens, it's how quickly and intensely you respond to it. It's the way your mind takes something neutral and turns it into something personal, something urgent, something that demands your full attention. When you begin to question that process, even slightly, the intensity starts to soften. A situation arises, and instead of being immediately swept into it, you pause. It might only last a second, maybe less, but within that pause, there is a kind of clarity that wasn't there before. You observe what's happening, both externally and internally. You notice the thought forming, the emotion building, the impulse to react. And instead of moving with it automatically, you allow yourself to choose. That choice is often quieter than expected. It doesn't feel like a grand decision. It feels like restraint, like stepping back just enough to see things more clearly. And in that moment, you begin to realize that not every reaction is necessary. Not every thought needs to be followed. Not every emotion needs to be expressed immediately. Some can be allowed to pass without turning into something larger. This is where a deeper kind of freedom begins to emerge. Not freedom from life's challenges, but freedom from being controlled by your immediate responses to them. Because when every thought leads to a reaction, and every reaction leads to more thoughts, you're caught in a cycle that never really gives you space to breathe. But when you introduce even a small pause into that cycle, the entire dynamic begins to shift. There's a line from Carl Jung that reflects this perfectly. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. That idea points directly to what's happening here. When you're unaware of your patterns, they feel inevitable. Your reactions feel automatic, your thoughts feel authoritative, and your emotional responses feel justified without question. But the moment you start observing them, they lose some of that power. You begin to see that what once felt like reality is often just interpretation. What once felt like certainty is often just repetition. And what once felt like something you had no control over is actually something you can step back from, even if only slightly at first. That awareness doesn't eliminate thoughts or emotions, but it changes your position in relation to them. As this awareness grows, you start to notice patterns that were invisible before. The same types of thoughts appearing in different situations. The same emotional responses triggered by familiar cues. The same narratives repeating themselves, even when the context changes. And once you see those patterns clearly, they begin to lose their hold over you. This doesn't mean you become detached from everything. It means you become less entangled in what doesn't serve you. You still experience emotions, but they don't pull you as far. You still have thoughts, but they don't define your actions as quickly. There's a kind of steadiness that begins to develop, not because life has become easier, but because you're no longer reacting to everything in the same way. That steadiness grows over time. The pauses become more natural. The awareness becomes more consistent, and the space between thought and reaction becomes something you can rely on, rather than something that appears occasionally. In that space, you begin to respond instead of react. And that distinction, while subtle, changes the entire quality of your experience. You start to feel less rushed internally, less pressured to respond immediately, less driven by impulses that once felt urgent. There's a sense of control that isn't based on forcing anything, but on understanding what's happening as it unfolds. And with that understanding comes a kind of calm that isn't dependent on external conditions. As this continues, the weight you once carried begins to shift. Not because situations have changed, but because you're no longer adding layers of unnecessary reaction to them. You're allowing things to be what they are without immediately turning them into something more. And in doing so, you create space not just in your thoughts, but in your entire experience. That space becomes the foundation for everything that follows. It allows you to engage with life more directly, without the constant interference of unchecked reactions. It gives you the ability to move through situations with clarity rather than confusion. And most importantly, it shows you that freedom isn't something you find outside of yourself. It begins in that small, often unnoticed moment where you choose not to react automatically and instead simply observe. There's a quiet habit most people carry without realizing it, and it shapes far more of their emotional life than they think. It's the tendency to take things personally, even when those things were never truly about them in the first place. A shift in someone's tone feels like rejection. A delayed response feels like disinterest. A critical remark feels like a direct attack on your worth. And before you even have time to question it, the feeling settles in as if it were fact. It feels real. It feels justified. But often, it's not accurate. The mind fills in gaps quickly. It doesn't like uncertainty, so when something is unclear, it creates a story. That story usually places you at the center, assigning meaning to someone else's behavior based on your own fears, your own past experiences, your own internal patterns. And because that story feels immediate, it rarely gets questioned. You move forward as if it were true, carrying the emotional weight that comes with it. But when you slow things down, even slightly, something becomes more visible. People act based on their own internal state, not yours. Their stress, their distractions, their insecurities, their habits, these are the forces shaping their behavior far more than anything related to you. A sharp tone might come from their own frustration. A lack of response might come from their own preoccupation. A critical comment might reflect their own perspective, not your actual value. And yet, without awareness, you absorb it all. You take in the tone, the silence, the words, and you turn them into something personal. You carry emotions that were never meant for you. You hold on to tension that originated somewhere else. And over time, that accumulation becomes heavy. Not because life is constantly attacking you, but because you're taking in more than you need to. This is where a shift begins to matter. Not a dramatic shift, not a complete detachment from others, but a simple step back. A moment where instead of immediately internalizing what happens, you pause and look at it more objectively. You ask yourself whether this situation truly belongs to you, or whether you've simply taken it on out of habit. And often, the answer is clearer than expected. There's a reflection from Marcus Aurelius that aligns closely with this idea. If you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it. That realization doesn't dismiss your feelings, but it redirects your attention. It shows you that the intensity of your reaction is often shaped more by your interpretation than by the event itself. As you begin to see this more clearly, your relationship with other people starts to change. You stop assuming that everything is about you. You stop interpreting every action as a reflection of your worth. And in doing so, you create space between what happens and how you feel about it. That space allows you to respond more calmly, more accurately, without immediately turning the situation into something personal. This doesn't mean you ignore everything. It doesn't mean you become indifferent to how others treat you. It means you become more selective. You start to recognize what deserves your attention and what doesn't. Genuine issues, meaningful conversations, situations that require action, these still matter. But the small, automatic reactions that once pulled you in begin to lose their hold. Over time, this selectivity becomes a form of protection, not a rigid barrier, but a quiet filter. You're no longer open to absorbing everything that passes by. You allow some things in, and you let others move past without attaching to them, and that alone reduces a significant amount of unnecessary emotional strain. There's also a deeper clarity that emerges from this shift. You begin to see people more accurately, not through the lens of your own insecurities, but through a broader understanding of their own experiences, their actions become less about you and more about them, and that understanding brings a kind of calm that wasn't there before. As that calm grows, your energy starts to stabilize. You're no longer reacting to every small change in someone's behavior. You're no longer adjusting your internal state based on external signals that may have nothing to do with you. Instead, you remain more consistent, more grounded, regardless of what's happening around you. This consistency changes how you move through relationships as well. You become less reactive, more thoughtful, more present. You're able to engage without constantly defending yourself against perceived threats that may not exist. And in doing so, your interactions become clearer, more genuine, less driven by hidden tension. At the same time, you begin to feel lighter. Not because people have changed, but because you've stopped carrying what was never yours. The emotional load you once picked up automatically starts to decrease. You realize that you don't need to process every tone, every expression, every word as if it were directed at your core. And as that realization settles in, something important becomes clear. Not everything deserves your reaction. Not everything deserves your energy. Some things can simply pass without being turned into something more. And when you allow that to happen, you create space not just in your mind, but in your entire experience. That space is where a different kind of freedom begins to take shape. A freedom that doesn't depend on how others behave, but on how you choose to interpret and respond. And once you begin to live from that place, even in small moments, the weight you once carried starts to fade in a way that feels both subtle and deeply relieving. At first, this shift doesn't feel comfortable. It feels unfamiliar, almost like you're stepping away from something that once gave you a sense of control. There's a part of you that resists loosening that grip because it has been there for so long that it feels necessary. Holding on tightly to outcomes, to expectations, to how things should unfold, it gives the illusion of stability. It feels like you're actively shaping your life, like you're staying ahead of uncertainty. But when you begin to let go, even slightly, there's a moment where that illusion fades, and it can feel unsettling. That discomfort is natural. It's what happens when a deeply ingrained habit starts to loosen. For a long time, control has been your way of navigating the world. It has been your method of reducing uncertainty, of trying to make things predictable, of creating a sense of order in situations that are inherently unpredictable. So when you stop tightening around everything, it can feel like you're exposing yourself to chaos, like you're leaving things up to chance in a way that feels risky. But if you stay with it, something begins to change. The initial discomfort doesn't last. It starts to give way to a different kind of experience, one that feels lighter, more open, less constrained. Situations that once triggered immediate tension begin to feel less intense, not because they've changed, but because your relationship to them has. You're no longer bracing yourself in the same way. You're no longer trying to force everything into a specific outcome. There's a subtle easing that happens in your body as well. The constant background tension begins to soften. You notice that you're not as tight, not as reactive, not as internally pressured to manage everything at once. Moments that would have previously felt overwhelming begin to pass with less resistance. They still happen, but they don't linger in the same way. They move through your experience instead of getting stuck in it. And this is where the shift becomes more noticeable. You begin to realize that the need for everything to go your way was never actually helping you as much as you thought. In fact, it was creating a kind of friction that made everything feel harder than it needed to be. The more you tried to control outcomes, the more tension you created when things didn't align with your expectations. And since things rarely unfold exactly as planned, that tension was almost constant. There's a reflection from Seneca that captures this idea in a simple way. A man who suffers before it is necessary suffers more than is necessary. That suffering often comes from resisting what is already happening or trying to prevent what hasn't happened yet. And when you begin to let go of that resistance, even slightly, the unnecessary layer of struggle begins to fade. What replaces it isn't passivity. It's a different kind of engagement. You still act, you still make decisions, you still move toward what matters to you, but you're no longer doing it with the same underlying tension. You're no longer tying your sense of stability to whether things go exactly as planned. Instead, you begin to trust your ability to respond, rather than trying to control every possible outcome in advance. This trust builds gradually. It doesn't appear all at once. It develops through experience, through noticing that when you stop forcing things, you don't fall apart. You adapt, you adjust, you move forward in ways that feel more natural, less strained. And as that becomes clearer, the need to hold on so tightly begins to weaken. There's also an interesting shift in how situations unfold around you when you're no longer resisting every deviation, when you're not constantly trying to force outcomes. Things often begin to move more smoothly. Not because you've gained more control, but because you've removed the friction that was interfering with the natural flow of events. You're no longer pushing against what is, and in that absence of resistance, there's more room for things to settle into place. This doesn't mean everything becomes easy. Challenges still arise. Uncertainty still exists. But your experience of those things changes. They don't feel like disruptions to a plan that must be preserved at all costs. They feel like part of the process, something to move through rather than something to fight against. As this becomes more familiar, the initial discomfort of letting go fades into something else entirely. A sense of ease, not because everything is perfect, but because you're no longer demanding that it be. A sense of clarity, because your mind isn't constantly trying to control what can't be controlled, and a sense of stability that comes not from external conditions, but from your ability to remain steady regardless of them. Over time, this way of approaching life begins to feel more natural than the old way. The constant tension, the need to control everything, the pressure to make things go exactly as planned, it starts to feel unnecessary, even exhausting in hindsight. And in its place, there's a quieter, more sustainable way of moving through the world. You begin to see that stability doesn't come from controlling everything around you. It comes from how you relate to it. And when that relationship shifts from resistance to acceptance, from tension to ease, from control to clarity, the entire experience of life begins to change. What once felt heavy begins to feel manageable. What once felt overwhelming begins to feel navigable, and what once required constant effort begins to unfold with a kind of natural rhythm. Not because life has changed, but because you have. So this begins to take a clearer shape in your life, not as an abstract idea, but as something practical, something you can actually feel in the way you move, think, and respond. Caring less in a healthy way doesn't mean stepping back from everything or becoming distant. It means stepping into things fully, but without tying your sense of peace to how they turn out. It means being present in what you're doing, without constantly measuring it, without needing it to validate you, without turning every outcome into a reflection of your worth. You start to notice it in your work. You still give effort, you still aim to do things well, but there's less pressure behind it. You're no longer carrying the weight of needing everything to succeed in a specific way. You focus on what you can actually influence, your attention, your discipline, your consistency, and you allow the results to unfold without attaching your identity to them. And because of that, your work often improves, not because you're trying harder, but because you're no longer distracted by the constant need for a certain outcome. It shows up in relationships as well. You care about people, you listen, you give your time and energy, but you're no longer trying to control how they feel about you or how they respond. You stop trying to secure approval or avoid every possible misunderstanding. Instead, you allow connections to exist as they are, without forcing them into a shape that makes you feel safe. And in that space, something more genuine begins to emerge. You're no longer interacting from a place of fear or control, but from a place of clarity. There's also a shift in how you experience everyday moments. You begin to notice things without immediately evaluating them. A conversation doesn't need to be perfect. A moment doesn't need to be optimized. An experience doesn't need to be turned into something more than it is. You allow things to happen without constantly asking whether they meet your expectations, and because of that, you're able to be more present, more grounded in what's actually happening rather than in what you think should be happening. This way of living doesn't remove effort. It refines it. You still take action where it matters. You still move toward what's important to you, but you're no longer carrying the additional burden of trying to control everything around that action. You're no longer resisting outcomes that don't align with your expectations. And because of that, your energy becomes more focused, less scattered across things you were never in charge of to begin with. There's a line from Marcus Aurelius that captures this in a simple but direct way. Do what you will. Even if you tear yourself apart, most people will continue doing the same things. It points to something most people eventually realize. You cannot control how others act, how they think, or how they respond. And once you accept that fully, you stop exhausting yourself trying to manage it. As that acceptance settles in, your attention naturally returns to what is actually yours, your actions, your decisions, your mindset. And when you focus there, your sense of stability becomes less dependent on external factors. You're no longer constantly adjusting yourself based on what's happening around you. Instead, you remain more consistent, more grounded, regardless of the situation. This creates a kind of quiet strength, not something loud or visible, but something you feel internally. You're able to move through situations without being pulled in every direction. You're able to care without becoming overwhelmed. You're able to engage without losing yourself in the process. And that balance changes how everything feels. Over time, this becomes less of something you practice and more of something you live. It starts to feel natural to let things pass without attaching to them. It becomes easier to focus on what matters without being distracted by what doesn't. And the constant background tension that once felt normal begins to fade. You also begin to recognize how much you were carrying before, not just responsibilities or challenges, but unnecessary thoughts, expectations, and emotional reactions that added weight without adding value. And as that becomes clearer, it becomes harder to return to the old way of holding on to everything. There's a sense of relief in that realization, not because life becomes simple, but because you stop complicating it. You stop turning every situation into something that needs to be controlled, analyzed, or fixed immediately. You allow things to unfold, and you respond when it's necessary, rather than reacting to everything automatically. And in that space, something important becomes clear. You were never meant to carry everything. You were never meant to manage every outcome, to absorb every emotion, to control every detail. That expectation was something you learned, something you adopted over time, and now you have the ability to let it go. That doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you care in a way that doesn't drain you. You engage with life in a way that supports you rather than exhausting you. And once you experience that, even briefly, it becomes something you naturally return to. Because when you remove what isn't necessary, what remains becomes clearer. Your actions become more intentional. Your thoughts become less cluttered. Your experience becomes lighter, not because there's less happening, but because you're no longer carrying what was never yours in the first place. There's a quiet strength that begins to form when you stop reacting to everything. It doesn't make you distant, it makes you steady. You start to move through situations with more clarity, less urgency, and far less noise in your mind. Things that once pulled you in no longer have the same grip. You begin to realize that peace isn't something you find outside, but something you protect within. And the more you practice this, the more natural it becomes, not a technique, but a way of being that stays with you in every moment. At the end of it all, nothing outside of you needed to change. The noise, the pressure, the uncertainty, it was always going to be there. The real shift happened within you, in how you choose to respond, in what you choose to carry, and in what you finally decide to let go of. That's where your peace lives. You've been giving away your power your whole life, and you didn't even notice it. Every time you reacted to someone who didn't deserve it, every time you explained yourself to people who were never going to understand, every moment you let someone pull you out of your peace, just to prove a point that was never worth proving. It didn't feel like weakness, it felt justified, it felt necessary. But slowly, quietly, it trained you to live at the mercy of other people. The Stoics understood something most people still miss. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that the real battle is never out there, it's within. Not controlling what others say, not correcting every misunderstanding, but mastering the impulse to react at all. Because the moment you stop needing to respond, to defend, to explain, something shifts. You become harder to reach, harder to shake, harder to control, and that kind of presence doesn't ask for respect. It creates it, quietly, without effort, without noise. It's the kind of control that doesn't need to prove itself, because it's already there. You don't notice how much of your life is controlled by reaction until you slow down enough to actually see it. It starts small. Someone says something slightly off, nothing obvious, just enough to create friction, and suddenly your mind isn't yours anymore. It starts replaying the moment over and over. You analyze tone, you question intent, you build responses you wish you had said, you refine them, you rehearse them, and while all of this is happening, you're gone. You're not present anymore. You're trapped in something that already ended. That's the cost most people never calculate. Reaction doesn't just affect the moment, it steals your awareness, and once your awareness is gone, control follows. This is where the shift begins, even if you don't realize it yet. Because control was never about dominating situations or proving points. It was about holding your internal state. The moment your emotions are shaped by someone else's words, something changes. You may still look composed on the outside, but internally you've already adjusted yourself to them. And the strange part is, it feels justified. It feels like you're doing the right thing, like you're standing your ground, but in reality, you're reacting on terms you didn't choose. You're stepping into a dynamic that was set for you, not by you. And every time that happens, even in small ways, you reinforce a pattern. A pattern where your peace is something that can be interrupted at any moment. Over time, that pattern becomes invisible. You stop questioning it. You start assuming this is just how life works. People say things, you respond. People challenge you, you explain. People misunderstand you, you clarify. And without noticing it, you've built a system where your energy is constantly being pulled outward. Your attention is scattered across things that don't deserve it. Your peace becomes conditional. And that's where most people stay. Not because they choose it, but because they never step back far enough to see it clearly. They don't see that the disturbance isn't coming from the situation, it's coming from how they engage with it. The Stoics saw this differently. They understood that not everything deserves a response, that not every comment needs to be answered, that not every situation requires your involvement, and more importantly, they understood that your control exists in the space between what happens and how you respond. It's a small space, easy to miss, but it's always there, and inside that space is your freedom. The problem is, most people move too fast to notice it. They react before they think. They speak before they choose. And that space disappears. But when you slow down, even slightly, something changes. You start to see the impulse before the action. You feel the reaction forming before it takes over. And in that moment, you have a choice. That choice is where everything begins to shift. You don't have to react. You don't have to explain. You don't have to engage with everything that comes your way. And when you start exercising that choice, even in small ways, you begin to take something back. Your attention becomes more focused, your energy becomes more stable. You're no longer pulled into every situation. You're deciding which ones deserve you, and that selectiveness changes how you move. You're not avoiding life, you're refining how you participate in it. At the same time, your perspective starts to evolve. You begin to see that most of what people say or do isn't really about you. It's shaped by their own experiences, their own limitations, their own way of seeing the world. And once you understand that, the need to take everything personally starts to fade. You don't feel the same pressure to respond. You don't feel the same urgency to correct or defend. You start to realize that not being understood by everyone isn't a problem. It's normal. And chasing that understanding often costs more than it gives. There's also a shift in how you use your silence. Before, silence may have felt like weakness, like something you fell into when you didn't know what to say. But now it becomes intentional. You choose it. And when you choose silence in moments where reaction is expected, it creates something most people aren't comfortable with: uncertainty. There's no feedback, no emotional signal, no clear reaction. And that absence changes the dynamic. Because now, instead of you thinking about them, they're left thinking about you. Not because you're trying to control them, but because you didn't give them what they expected. But this doesn't mean withdrawing from everything or becoming distant. That's where most people misunderstand the idea. You're still present, still aware, still engaged, but you're selective. You don't give your attention freely. You don't respond automatically. You choose when to speak, when to step in, and when to step back. And that selectiveness creates value, because what is always available is rarely appreciated. But what is controlled, measured, and intentional carries weight. It creates a different kind of presence, one that doesn't need to prove itself. And as you continue to operate this way, something deeper begins to form. You're not just avoiding negativity, you're redefining your standard. Every time you ignore something that doesn't deserve you, you reinforce a quiet boundary. You remind yourself that not everything is worth your energy. And over time, that standard becomes part of how you move. You don't have to think about it. You feel it. You recognize what aligns with you and what doesn't, and you act accordingly, without hesitation, without explanation. That's where discipline comes in, because your mind will still try to pull you back into old patterns. It will still push you to react, to defend, to prove. But now, you notice it. You see the trigger before it takes over. You understand where it's coming from, and instead of following it, you observe it. That awareness weakens its control. It creates distance between you and the reaction, and in that distance, you regain stability, not by suppressing emotion, but by not being ruled by it. And eventually, you reach a point where you no longer feel the need to act in every situation. Not everything requires your response. Not every comment deserves your attention. Not every conflict needs your involvement. And in that restraint, something powerful happens. You conserve energy. While others are busy reacting, explaining, and exhausting themselves, you're building, you're focusing, you're moving forward without interruption. That's the quiet advantage. No noise, no distraction, just control. If this way of thinking resonates with you, don't let it pass like everything else. Stay with it. Build on it. And if you're serious about moving this way, consider subscribing. Not as a routine, but as a decision. A commitment to think more clearly, to react less impulsively, and to live with more control than you did yesterday. That shift is subtle, but it changes everything. Because now you're no longer just communicating, you're seeking validation. You're trying to correct someone else's perception of you, hoping that if they see you clearly, they'll respond differently. And in doing that, you've placed your sense of clarity in their hands. You've made their understanding a condition for your peace. That's where the imbalance begins. Because the truth is, people don't misunderstand you in a neutral way. They interpret you through their own lens, shaped by their experiences, their beliefs, their insecurities, and their expectations. What they see isn't just you, it's you filtered through everything they already are. And that means something important. No amount of explanation guarantees alignment. You can choose your words carefully, you can clarify your intentions, you can repeat yourself in 10 different ways, and still, they may not see what you're trying to show them, not because you failed to explain, but because their perspective isn't built to receive it. This is where most people get stuck. They assume that more effort will fix the gap, that if they just say it better, more clearly, more patiently, eventually it will click. But often, it doesn't. And the more they try, the more energy they lose. Over time, this becomes exhausting, not in a dramatic way, but in a slow, draining way that wears you down without you noticing. You start anticipating misunderstandings before they even happen. You rehearse explanations in your head. You overthink your words, your tone, your timing. And instead of speaking freely, you start speaking defensively, not because you're being attacked, but because you're trying to prevent being misunderstood. That's how deeply this pattern can settle in. It reshapes not just how you communicate, but how you think. There's also a hidden consequence that's easy to overlook. The more you explain yourself unnecessarily, the more you teach people that you need to. You create an expectation that your actions, your decisions, your thoughts all require justification. And once that expectation is established, it becomes difficult to step away from it. Because now, silence feels like avoidance. It feels like something is missing. But in reality, silence is often the clearest boundary you can set. It says that not everything needs to be explained, and not everyone is entitled to your reasoning. This is where a different perspective begins to take shape. Instead of trying to control how others see you, you start focusing on how you see yourself. You begin to understand that clarity doesn't come from external agreement. It comes from internal alignment. When you know what you meant, when you understand your intentions, when you're grounded in your own reasoning, the need to explain starts to fade. Not because you don't care, but because you're no longer dependent on someone else's interpretation to feel stable. There's a line from Epictetus that captures this shift perfectly. It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. And when it comes to being misunderstood, the reaction most people default to is explanation. But what if the more controlled response is restraint? What if the strength lies not in saying more, but in knowing when enough has already been said? That's where the balance begins to return. You're no longer chasing understanding. You're choosing when it's worth pursuing. This doesn't mean you stop communicating or that you become distant. It means your communication becomes intentional. You explain when it adds value, when it clarifies something that genuinely matters, when the other person is actually open to understanding. But you stop explaining as a reflex. You stop doing it out of discomfort, out of fear of being seen the wrong way, out of the need to correct every misinterpretation. And in that shift, something important happens. You reclaim your energy. There's also a deeper layer to this. When you stop over-explaining, you begin to see how often people project their own assumptions onto you. You notice how quickly conclusions are formed, how easily intentions are assigned, how little effort is sometimes made to actually understand. And instead of trying to correct every one of those projections, you allow them to exist without engaging with them. Not because they're accurate, but because they're not yours to manage. That realization creates space. Space to think clearly, to act deliberately, to move without constantly adjusting yourself to fit someone else's perspective. It removes a layer of pressure that most people carry without realizing it's there. And once that pressure is gone, your interactions start to feel different, lighter, more direct, less complicated. At the same time, your sense of identity becomes more stable. It's no longer shaped by how well others understand you. It's anchored in how well you understand yourself. That stability makes you less reactive, less defensive, less inclined to overcorrect. You don't feel the same urgency to be seen a certain way because you're not relying on that perception to define you. And this is where the connection to control becomes clear again. Just like with reaction, explanation can quietly shift control away from you. Not in an obvious way, but in a subtle, ongoing exchange where your energy is constantly directed outward, trying to manage how you're perceived. When you step out of that pattern, when you stop explaining by default, you bring that energy back inward. You use it to strengthen your own clarity instead of trying to fix someone else's interpretation. Over time, this becomes a habit. You pause before explaining. You ask yourself whether it's necessary, whether it adds anything, whether the other person is even in a position to understand. And if the answer is no, you let it go. You move on without filling the silence, without correcting the narrative, without chasing resolution where it doesn't exist. That restraint doesn't make you less expressive, it makes you more precise. Your words carry more weight because they're not used to defend every detail. They're used when they matter, and because of that, they land differently. People pay more attention, not because you're saying more, but because you're saying less with intention. In the end, the shift is simple, but not easy. You stop trying to control how others interpret you, and you start controlling how you respond to being interpreted. You let go of the need to be fully understood by everyone, and you focus on being clear within yourself. And once that becomes your foundation, misunderstanding loses its power to disturb you. There's a different way to move through moments that usually pull you in. It doesn't look dramatic, it doesn't feel loud. In fact, at first it almost feels unnatural. Someone tries to provoke you, maybe with a comment, maybe with a tone, maybe with something subtle enough that only you catch it. And instead of reacting the way you normally would, you pause. You don't respond. You don't correct them. You don't show anything on your face that confirms they reached you. You simply let the moment pass without feeding it. That silence, in that exact moment, changes the entire dynamic. That absence creates something most people aren't comfortable with: uncertainty. When there's no reaction, no emotional signal, no clear feedback, the other person is left with their own interpretation. They start questioning what just happened. Did it land? Did it matter? Was it ignored on purpose? That lack of clarity becomes a space their mind tries to fill. And the more they think about it, the more their attention turns inward, away from you and toward their own assumptions. There's a kind of psychological pressure that silence creates, not through force, but through absence. People are used to feedback. They rely on it to navigate interactions. A reaction tells them where they stand, whether they crossed a line, whether they succeeded in getting a response. Without that feedback, they lose their reference point, and in that uncertainty, their confidence in the interaction starts to weaken. They're no longer in control of how the moment unfolds. What makes this even more effective is that it requires no effort beyond restraint. You're not trying to outsmart anyone. You're not crafting the perfect response. You're simply choosing not to participate in something that doesn't deserve your energy. And that choice, repeated consistently, builds a different kind of presence. One that isn't easily pulled into unnecessary exchanges. One that doesn't react on impulse. One that remains steady, even when tested. There's also something important happening internally when you practice this kind of silence. You're strengthening your ability to sit with discomfort without acting on it, because the urge to respond doesn't disappear immediately. It's still there, pushing you to say something, to correct, to engage. But when you resist that urge, even briefly, you prove to yourself that it doesn't control you. And that realization builds confidence. Not the loud kind, but the quiet kind that doesn't need to be displayed. Over time, this changes how you experience interactions. Situations that once felt tense or draining start to feel neutral. Comments that would have stayed with you for hours lose their impact. You begin to see how much of your previous stress came not from what was said, but from how you responded to it. And once that becomes clear, the motivation to react starts to fade. It no longer feels necessary. There's a line that captures this idea with precision. No man is free who is not master of himself. Freedom, in this sense, isn't about controlling others or shaping every interaction to your liking. It's about maintaining control over your own responses, even when the situation invites you to lose it. Silence becomes one of the simplest ways to practice that control, not because it avoids the situation, but because it prevents the situation from controlling you. As this approach becomes more natural, people begin to notice the difference. Not always consciously, but they feel it. There's a shift in how they interact with you. Some may test it, trying to get a reaction, pushing a little further to see if the pattern holds. Others become more measured, more respectful, because they sense you're not easily drawn in. And in both cases, the dynamic has changed. You're no longer responding automatically. You're choosing when and how to engage. As Seneca put it, "He who is brave is free." This doesn't mean you never speak or that you avoid every confrontation. There are moments where a response is necessary, where clarity matters, where silence would only create confusion. But those moments become easier to recognize when they're not buried under layers of automatic reaction. You respond when it's intentional, not when it's triggered, and that distinction is what keeps your control intact. That filter is what most people lack. They move through life open to everything, responding to every comment, every message, every shift in energy around them. And because of that, their attention is constantly scattered. Their presence is diluted. They're everywhere, reacting to everything, but never fully grounded in anything. It feels like participation, but it's actually a loss of direction. Because when you're available to everything, you're controlled by anything. That decision-making process is where your power begins to return. Because now, instead of being pulled into interactions, you're stepping into them intentionally. You're not reacting, you're choosing. And that choice creates a different kind of presence. One that isn't easily predictable, one that isn't constantly available, one that carries weight because it's not overused. There's a noticeable difference between someone who is always accessible and someone who is selectively present. The first becomes expected, their responses are assumed, their time is taken for granted. The second creates a sense of value, not through force, but through scarcity. When your presence is not guaranteed, it becomes something people pay attention to. Not because you demand it, but because you've set a standard without saying a word. This is where most people hesitate. They worry that stepping back will be seen as disinterest or disrespect, that if they don't respond quickly or engage consistently, they'll lose connection. But what often happens is the opposite. When you stop overextending yourself, when you stop being constantly available, your interactions become more meaningful. You're no longer engaging out of habit or obligation. You're engaging because it matters. That shift also changes how you experience your own time. Without the constant pull to respond, to engage, to be present everywhere, you create space. Space to think, to focus, to move at your own pace. And in that space, your actions become more deliberate. You're not rushing from one interaction to the next. You're choosing where to invest yourself. There's a line that reflects this idea with clarity. It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a lot of it. When your attention is spread across too many things, when your energy is given freely without consideration, it doesn't just affect your interactions. It affects your entire sense of time. It feels like there's never enough of it, not because it's limited, but because it's being used without intention. As you become more selective, that sense of time begins to shift. You're no longer reacting to every demand placed on you. You're deciding which demands are worth your response. And that decision creates boundaries, not rigid ones, but clear ones. Boundaries that protect your focus, your energy, your ability to stay grounded in what matters. This refinement doesn't make you less connected. It makes your connections more intentional. You're not spreading yourself thin across every interaction. You're investing fully in the ones that align with you. And because of that, those interactions carry more depth. They're not rushed. They're not distracted. They're present. There's also an internal shift that happens alongside this. As you become more selective externally, you become more stable internally. You're not constantly adjusting your state based on what's happening around you. You're maintaining a consistent center, regardless of external noise. That consistency makes it easier to stay focused, to stay calm, to stay in control. Over time, this way of operating becomes natural. You no longer feel the need to respond to everything. You no longer feel uncomfortable with silence or space. You begin to trust that not every situation requires your involvement, that not every moment needs your input. And that trust allows you to move through life with less friction. The idea of control, then, becomes less about managing others and more about managing yourself. It's not about influencing every interaction. It's about choosing which interactions you step into. It's not about being present everywhere. It's about being fully present where it matters. And in that selectiveness, something changes in how others perceive you, not because you're trying to create an image, but because your behavior reflects a certain level of discipline. You're not easily pulled in, you're not constantly available, you're measured. And that measurement creates a sense of respect, even if it's not explicitly acknowledged. At the same time, your own perception of yourself begins to shift. You start to see that you don't need to be involved in everything to be relevant. You don't need to respond to every comment to maintain your position. Your value isn't tied to how often you engage, but to how intentionally you do. You're still in the world, still interacting, still connected. But now there's a structure behind it, a sense that your presence is directed, not scattered, that your responses are chosen, not triggered. And that difference, while subtle, reshapes everything around you. And that decision has consequences, not in a negative sense, but in a natural one. When you raise your internal standard, your external environment begins to adjust. Some people will notice the change immediately. They'll feel the difference in how you respond or don't respond. They'll realize that certain behaviors no longer get the same reaction from you. And without that reaction, those behaviors lose their effect. They either adapt or they fade out. This is where your internal standard begins to shape your external reality. You don't need to push people away. You don't need to explain your boundaries. You don't need to justify your choices. Your behavior does that for you. The consistency of your actions communicates more clearly than any explanation could. It shows what you accept, what you ignore, what you invest in, and people respond to that, whether consciously or not. There's also a sense of clarity that comes with this shift. When you stop engaging with what's beneath your standard, your focus sharpens. You're no longer distracted by things that don't matter. You're no longer carrying conversations, arguments, or thoughts that add nothing to your direction. That mental space becomes available for something else, something more aligned, more constructive, more intentional. Over time, this clarity strengthens your sense of identity. You're not constantly adjusting based on external input. You're operating from a consistent internal position. That consistency makes your decisions easier. It removes the hesitation, the overthinking, the second-guessing. You know what aligns with you and what doesn't, and that knowledge reduces friction in your daily life. There's a line that reflects this idea in a simple but direct way. Associate with people who are likely to improve you. It's not just about choosing who you spend time with. It's about choosing what you allow into your space in general. Conversations, environments, interactions, even thoughts. When you filter these through a higher standard, your entire experience begins to shift. At the same time, you begin to notice how much of your previous engagement was unnecessary. Situations that once felt important start to look trivial. Reactions that once felt justified start to feel excessive. And that awareness reinforces your decision to operate differently. It's not about avoiding life. It's about engaging with it more deliberately. There's also a quiet confidence that develops from this approach. Not the kind that needs to be displayed or validated, but the kind that comes from knowing you're not easily pulled into things that don't serve you. You trust your ability to choose. You trust your ability to step back. You trust your ability to maintain your level, regardless of what's happening around you. At the same time, your relationships become more aligned. You're no longer maintaining connections out of habit or obligation. You're engaging with people and situations that match your standard. And because of that, those connections carry more value. They're not based on constant interaction, but on meaningful interaction. The process isn't instant. It requires consistency. It requires awareness. It requires the willingness to let go of patterns that once felt normal. But each time you choose not to engage with something beneath you, you reinforce that shift. You strengthen that standard. You make it clearer, both to yourself and to others. At that point, ignoring what doesn't deserve you is no longer a strategy. It's a reflection of who you've become. None of this is easy. It sounds simple when you hear it, almost obvious, but the moment you try to apply it, you feel the resistance immediately. Because your mind is not naturally built for stillness in the face of pressure. It's built to react, to defend, to justify, to prove. That impulse has been reinforced over years through habits, experiences, and expectations. So when you decide to move differently, you're not just changing your behavior, you're going against a pattern that has been running automatically for a long time. This is where most people stop. They feel the reaction, they justify it, and they act on it. But the Stoics approached this differently. They didn't just observe their reactions, they examined them. They looked at what triggered them, what caused the emotional shift, what underlying belief or expectation was being challenged. Not to excuse the reaction, but to understand it. Because understanding changes how something affects you. When you start asking yourself why something bothers you, the answer is rarely as simple as it first appears. It might seem like the issue is what someone said or did, but often it's connected to something else. A need to be respected, a desire to be understood, an expectation that wasn't met. And once you see that, the situation starts to lose some of its intensity. Because now it's not just about what happened, it's about how you're interpreting it. This is where discipline and awareness begin to work together. You notice the trigger. You feel the reaction starting to build, but instead of moving with it immediately, you step back, even slightly. You question it, not in a complicated way, but in a direct one. Why does this matter to me right now? What is this actually affecting? And in that moment of reflection, something shifts. The reaction loses its urgency. Over time, this process becomes more natural. You don't have to force yourself to pause. It happens automatically. You begin to recognize patterns in your own behavior. You see which situations tend to trigger you, which types of comments affect you more than others, which environments pull you into reaction. And with that awareness, those triggers start to weaken. Not because they disappear, but because you understand them. Understanding removes a lot of their power. When something is unclear, it feels overwhelming. When it's understood, it becomes manageable. And that's what happens with your triggers. They go from being automatic responses to being observable patterns. You see them as they are, without immediately acting on them. And that space between awareness and action is where your control grows. This doesn't mean you stop feeling. You still experience emotions. You still notice when something doesn't sit right. But the difference is, those feelings don't dictate your behavior in the same way. You're not pulled into action by them. You're aware of them, but you're not controlled by them. And that distinction is what creates stability. Stability in this sense isn't about being unaffected by everything. It's about not being easily moved by things that don't deserve that level of influence. It's about maintaining a consistent internal state, even when external situations shift. And that consistency makes you less predictable in the best way. Not because you're trying to be unpredictable, but because you're not reacting in the expected way. There's also a level of freedom that comes with this. When your triggers no longer control you, your options expand. You're not limited to one type of response. You're not locked into a pattern of behavior. You can choose how to respond or whether to respond at all. And that choice gives you flexibility. It allows you to move through situations without being tied to a specific reaction. As Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength." At the same time, your interactions become more intentional. You're not responding out of habit or impulse. You're responding because you've decided it's worth it, and that decision is based on clarity, not emotion. It's based on understanding, not reaction. That shift makes your responses more effective, more precise, more aligned with your actual intentions. As this becomes part of how you operate, people begin to notice the difference. They may not understand it fully, but they see that you're not easily provoked, that you don't react the way most people do, that certain things that would normally cause a reaction don't seem to affect you in the same way. And that creates a different kind of presence, one that feels steady, grounded, controlled. This presence isn't something you perform. It's a result of the internal work you've done, the examination of your triggers, the discipline to pause, the awareness to understand what's happening beneath the surface. It's built over time, through repetition, through consistency. And once it's there, it doesn't need to be maintained in a forced way. It becomes natural. There's also a shift in how you view other people when you reach this point. You begin to see that their actions, their words, their behavior are often driven by their own triggers, their own patterns. And instead of reacting to them, you observe them. Not in a detached way, but in a way that recognizes what's actually happening. And that recognition makes it easier to stay grounded. This is where indifference takes on a different meaning. It's not about not caring. It's about not being controlled. It's about choosing what affects you and what doesn't. It's about maintaining your position regardless of what's happening around you. And that kind of indifference is not cold, it's stable. It allows you to move through situations without being pulled into them unnecessarily. It allows you to engage when it matters and step back when it doesn't. It allows you to maintain your energy, your focus, your clarity. And over time, it becomes the foundation of how you operate. Because in the end, the goal was never to eliminate emotion or avoid interaction. It was to understand yourself well enough that your reactions are no longer automatic, that your behavior is no longer dictated by external triggers, that your state is no longer dependent on what happens around you. And once that becomes your reality, control is no longer something you're trying to achieve. It's something you already have. At some point, something shifts in a way that feels almost invisible at first, but changes everything once you notice it. You no longer feel the same urgency to respond to everything around you. Situations that once pulled you in immediately now pass by without that automatic need to engage. Comments don't carry the same weight. Tension doesn't demand your participation. And what used to feel like something you had to address now feels optional. That realization is subtle, but it marks a turning point. Because once you see that not everything requires your response, you begin to move differently. This shift changes how you experience time and energy. When you're no longer reacting to everything, you stop spending your mental resources on things that don't matter. You're not replaying conversations. You're not thinking about what you should have said. You're not carrying interactions with you long after they've ended. That mental space, once occupied by reaction and analysis, becomes available. And what you do with that space determines the direction you move in. When you step out of that pattern, the difference is immediate. Your attention becomes more focused. Your actions become more deliberate. You're not switching between distractions. You're staying with what matters. And that consistency creates momentum. Not the kind that looks dramatic, but the kind that builds steadily over time. You're no longer reacting to what's happening around you. You're directing your energy toward what you've chosen. There's a line that captures this idea with precision. If you seek tranquility, do less. It doesn't mean you become inactive. It means you remove what's unnecessary. You stop doing things that don't contribute to your direction. You stop engaging in situations that don't add value. And in doing less of what doesn't matter, you create space for what does. That's where real progress begins. Not in doing more, but in doing what matters consistently. This approach also changes how others interact with you. When you're not easily drawn into every situation, people begin to recognize that your attention isn't automatic. They see that you're not reacting in the expected way. And that creates a different dynamic. Some may test it, trying to see if they can still pull you in. Others may adjust, becoming more intentional in how they approach you. But in both cases, the pattern has changed. You're no longer responding on impulse. At the same time, your own sense of control becomes more stable. You're not constantly adjusting your state based on what's happening around you. You're maintaining a consistent direction, regardless of external noise. That consistency makes it easier to stay focused, to stay calm, to stay aligned with what you've chosen. You're not being pulled, you're moving. There's also a sense of quiet confidence that develops from this. Not the kind that needs to be expressed or proven, but the kind that comes from knowing you're not easily distracted. You trust your ability to stay on course. You trust your ability to ignore what doesn't matter. You trust your ability to maintain your focus, even when there are opportunities to lose it. And that trust removes a lot of internal tension. As this becomes your default, your progress begins to look different. It's not loud, it's not reactive, it's not driven by external pressure. It's steady, controlled, and consistent. You're building without interruption. You're moving forward without being pulled sideways. And that kind of movement over time creates results that are difficult to replicate through constant reaction. There's also a shift in how you view conflict. You begin to see that not every disagreement needs to be resolved, not every comment needs to be addressed, not every situation needs your involvement. And by stepping back from unnecessary conflict, you conserve energy that can be used elsewhere. You're not avoiding conflict. You're choosing which ones are worth your time. This selectiveness reinforces everything that has been building. You're not reacting, you're not explaining, and you're not engaging with what doesn't align with you. And in that restraint, you create a kind of efficiency. Your actions are no longer scattered, they're directed. Your energy is no longer divided, it's focused, and that focus becomes your advantage. Over time, this advantage compounds. While others are caught in cycles of reaction, explanation, and distraction, you're moving forward without those interruptions. You're not spending energy on things that don't contribute to your direction. You're not losing time to situations that don't matter. You're not carrying unnecessary weight. And because of that, your progress is cleaner, more consistent, more sustainable. This doesn't mean your life becomes empty or quiet in a negative way. It becomes clear. There's less noise, less distraction, less unnecessary involvement. And in that clarity, you're able to see what actually matters. You're able to focus on it without interruption. You're able to build without being pulled away. At the same time, your presence becomes more grounded. You're not reacting to every shift in your environment. You're not adjusting your behavior based on every external input. You're stable. And that stability is what allows everything else to function more effectively. Your decisions are clearer. Your actions are more intentional. Your direction is more defined. Eventually, this way of operating becomes natural. You don't have to think about whether something deserves your attention. You know. You don't have to force yourself to ignore distractions. You simply don't engage with them. You don't have to remind yourself to stay focused. You already are. And that natural alignment is what makes the difference sustainable. Because in the end, the goal was never to control everything around you. It was to control how you move within it. And when you reach the point where not everything requires your response, where not everything deserves your attention, where not every situation needs your involvement, you've achieved something that most people spend their lives chasing without realizing it. You've created a way of operating that allows you to move forward without being constantly pulled back. At the end of all this, it comes down to something simple, but not easy. Your peace is not something to negotiate. It's something to protect. The moment you stop reacting, stop explaining, and stop giving your energy to what doesn't deserve it, you take your life back in a way most people never do. Let me ask something real. When was the last time a single word from someone made your chest tighten, your mind race, or your calm slip for hours or even days? When did someone's silence linger longer than expected, leaving you replaying every gesture, every tone, every pause, as if your inner peace depended on their choices? Most people hand over pieces of themselves in these moments, allowing others to pull at their emotions without even realizing it. The Stoics taught that mastery is not about controlling others. It is about mastering the self, holding the mind steady even when the world is in turmoil. Every thought, every subtle reaction, every twitch of expression communicates more than words ever could. A pause before speaking, a flicker of hope, the tightness in the jaw. These signals are quietly observed by anyone watching. The Stoics called these external impressions, and they warned that letting them govern your inner life is voluntary enslavement. By noticing these impressions without surrendering to them, you reclaim the space between stimulus and response. It is here, in this interval, that choice exists and presence begins. Small acts of restraint create a foundation for calm that cannot be disturbed by the external world. This is not shutting down or hiding from life. It is deliberate engagement, grounded in reason and clarity. To be fully present while remaining unshaken by what you cannot control is the quiet strength the Stoics valued above all. Each moment of observation without reactive surrender teaches the mind that power resides within, and when exercised wisely, even the most chaotic circumstances begin to move differently around you. Presence, restraint, and intentionality become your silent influence, shaping interactions in ways that words alone could never achieve. Every movement of thought, every subtle twitch of expression communicates more than words ever could. A tightening of the jaw, a pause before speaking, the quiet flare of hope in the chest when awaiting a response. These are signals others register, often without conscious awareness. Colleagues, friends, and even strangers are constantly observing, gathering data on what can influence, unsettle, or motivate you. The Stoics called these external impressions, understanding that when allowed unchecked, they govern the mind without consent. Each time we react without awareness, we surrender a piece of control, handing over authority to forces outside ourselves. By pausing, by simply noticing without absorbing, we reclaim a space that cannot be touched by circumstance or the expectations of others. This interval, the gap between stimulus and response, is where choice exists. Presence, calm, and clarity emerge there. The smallest act of restraint signals that our inner life is sovereign. The face we show becomes an instrument, not a mirror. The world begins to adjust to a rhythm determined by our steadiness, not by their provocation. In these quiet moments, influence is cultivated without force, and mastery is exercised without declaration. The elegance of this practice lies in its subtle accumulation. Every unreacted insult, every withheld comment, every deliberate silence contributes to a pattern understood subconsciously by those around you. People adjust their expectations, test less, and recognize, even intuitively, that your responses are no longer predictable. What once provoked frustration or agitation now meets calm observation, and the energy of others begins to flow differently. Relationships, professional interactions and everyday exchanges transform into arenas where influence operates through presence, not volume. By observing without surrender, by responding only when deliberate, you cultivate a mind that is less contingent on external events and more anchored in internal judgment. Each controlled reaction reinforces self-command, establishing a psychological landscape in which calm is habitual rather than occasional. Stresses that would have once unsettled the mind now pass without taking root, and the individual becomes a stabilizing force even amid chaos. Subtlety becomes authority, and measured attention commands respect without assertion. The Stoics described this as mastery over self, a quiet power that guides interaction and perception without needing to dominate. Over time, this discipline transforms the very way you engage with the world. The individual who governs reactions develops influence that is nearly invisible yet profoundly effective. Others no longer anticipate predictable responses, and leverage through provocation disappears. Timing, tone, and attention are consciously managed, and interactions unfold on your terms rather than being dictated by circumstance. Each pause, each considered response, each moment of deliberate observation reinforces autonomy. Presence itself communicates authority, shaping social dynamics without coercion. The mind that practices this consistently becomes resilient, discerning, and steady, capable of participating fully without surrendering its equilibrium. By mastering the small, quiet moments, you cultivate the foundation of influence that permeates every aspect of life. You become untouchable, not through aggression or volume, but through measured control over the one thing no one else can claim: your inner state. Subscribing is more than a simple click. It is a conscious step toward practicing the same principles, a commitment to cultivating clarity, restraint, and deliberate presence in your own life. By subscribing, you choose to invest in a mindset where calm and reason guide action rather than the chaos outside. It is a personal step toward mastery of the self, toward influence rooted in understanding and discipline, and toward a life led from deliberate presence rather than reflexive reaction. Need is a quiet weight that often goes unnoticed, a subtle pull that shapes choices, attitudes, and perceptions without us realizing it. When you seek approval, recognition, or validation, the mind surrenders a measure of control to external forces. Every expectation placed upon another, every hope pinned to a response, is a tacit admission that someone else holds a key to your peace. The Stoics observed that true tranquility depends on mastering internal priorities rather than relying on outcomes outside oneself. Dependency, even when disguised as simple desire or connection, is the thread that others can tug to influence thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. When the mind is conditioned to rely on external affirmation, it becomes pliable, susceptible to the subtle currents of influence that ripple through everyday interactions. By noticing this dynamic, you recognize that control is rarely lost in dramatic confrontations. It is seeded in quiet concessions, in the habitual expectation that someone else must validate your worth or secure your comfort. A single moment of need may feel insignificant, yet the accumulation of these moments forms an invisible tether, binding the spirit to circumstances over which it has no real authority. To reclaim independence, it is necessary first to recognize where these dependencies reside, to observe the repeated patterns of wanting and hoping, and to understand that they are not weaknesses but points of influence quietly claimed by the external world. Acknowledging need as a source of vulnerability allows for a subtle shift in perception. Instead of reacting to scarcity, denial, or absence as if the world has wronged you, you begin to observe these impulses without attachment. The Stoics called this the practice of separating what is within your control from what is not, cultivating a sense of self that is resilient to the fluctuations of circumstance. Each time you notice a desire for attention, affirmation, or reassurance, it becomes an opportunity to exercise choice. Instead of immediately seeking the response that would quiet the mind, you allow the internal state to remain intact, unshaken by absence or delay. This deliberate restraint does not diminish connection. It strengthens it by clarifying the boundaries of influence. The moment when the need is identified and consciously released is also the moment when the mind steps out of the shadow of external leverage. You begin to experience the subtle freedom of knowing that nothing outside your control can dictate inner calm. The recognition of this principle gradually transforms interactions because those around you can no longer exploit unspoken expectations. Silence, stillness, and deliberate self-possession replace the reflexive habits of seeking validation. The release of need also transforms relationships and social dynamics. People may initially respond to this shift with confusion or even resistance because the familiar patterns have changed. When approval is no longer eagerly sought, recognition is no longer anxiously awaited, and reassurance is no longer compulsively requested, the usual levers of influence vanish. Others, accustomed to guiding behavior through subtle cues or overt requests, find themselves unable to direct your attention or manipulate your emotional state. What emerges is a space of genuine agency, a calm authority that is neither demanding nor distant. This does not imply isolation. It implies the cultivation of autonomy, where presence is offered from choice rather than obligation. In social and professional interactions alike, detachment from external validation fosters an inner equilibrium, a quiet confidence that allows for engagement without surrender. The mind that is free from need can participate fully, respond thoughtfully, and maintain perspective even when circumstances are unpredictable. It is a state of alignment in which responses are guided by judgment rather than instinctive dependency, and in this alignment, influence flows from the center of personal authority rather than from the desire to satisfy external expectations. Independence from need also enhances clarity and discernment. When the mind is untethered from external pressures, it can assess situations objectively, prioritize effectively, and make decisions that reflect values rather than impulses. Each moment of autonomy strengthens judgment, reinforcing the understanding that internal resources, reason, awareness, and composure are sufficient to navigate complexity. The Stoics emphasized that contentment is cultivated through mastery over the self, rather than through acquisition or approval from the world. When the habit of non-dependency is practiced consistently, the mind becomes less reactive and more attuned to principles rather than outcomes. The subtle tension of longing diminishes, replaced by the steady knowledge that peace and clarity are available regardless of the external environment. This discipline allows for action that is deliberate, purposeful, and aligned with long-term intentions rather than the shifting preferences of others. By fostering this habit, you establish a resilient baseline from which engagement is neither desperate nor defensive, but informed, balanced, and self-directed. There is also a profound psychological impact in observing how liberation from need reshapes desire itself. When approval or validation is no longer pursued compulsively, desires can be examined, refined, and redirected toward intrinsic goals rather than fleeting gratifications. What once felt urgent or indispensable is experienced instead with equanimity, allowing for reflection on its true significance and value. This reframing cultivates a disciplined desire that seeks growth, understanding, and fulfillment within the self, rather than in the fleeting responses of others. Each act of releasing need is an exercise in self-sovereignty, reinforcing the principle that external contingencies do not dictate inner experience. Over time, the mind begins to anticipate engagement from a place of sufficiency rather than deficiency. When interactions unfold, they are approached with calm intentionality, and the influence of others is experienced as incidental rather than determinative. The subtle power in this practice lies not in control over the external world, but in mastery over the internal one, where dependency once held sway. Even subtle dependencies can erode self-possession over time, so consistent attention to need is essential. Each moment of longing, hope, or expectation presents an opportunity to practice observation and deliberate release. By cultivating awareness of these impulses and choosing not to act on them reflexively, the mind develops resilience, patience, and clarity. The practice is neither punitive nor harsh. It is the careful tending of inner life, like pruning branches to allow a tree to grow straight and strong. The result is not detachment in the sense of coldness or disconnection, but a disciplined engagement with the world that preserves autonomy while allowing genuine presence. Through repeated practice, the individual learns to respond from a place of calm sufficiency rather than reactive need, transforming ordinary interactions into exercises in thoughtful presence and mindful influence. In this process, the mind also develops a heightened sensitivity to the distinction between genuine value and transient expectation. Recognition, affirmation, and reassurance are no longer taken as measures of worth. They are perceived as external circumstances with limited bearing on internal equilibrium. By disentangling self-perception from external feedback, the individual cultivates an unshakable base from which engagement is deliberate and influence is subtle but pervasive. This is the essence of self-governance, the freedom to participate fully in life without surrendering authority over the inner experience. The Stoics emphasized that contentment and resilience are cultivated internally, and the consistent practice of releasing need is a practical embodiment of that teaching. Each instance of deliberate non-dependency reinforces the understanding that peace is cultivated from within and that true freedom arises when the mind is no longer subject to the imperatives of external desire or expectation. Through these practices, autonomy becomes habitual. The mind, trained to release need, develops an internal landscape that is stable, resourceful, and capable of sustaining engagement in any circumstance. Interaction becomes a choice, attention becomes intentional, and influence arises not from coercion, but from presence and equanimity. What was once a source of vulnerability transforms into a subtle foundation of power, quiet yet undeniable. By cultivating this discipline, each encounter, each conversation, and each expectation is met with clarity and presence, reinforcing the Stoic principle that the mind is sovereign, resilient, and unshaken, regardless of the external world. Freedom from need is not an abstract ideal. It is a practical state of being, realized through repeated attention, reflection, and deliberate engagement, establishing a life defined by calm authority and deliberate presence. Silence carries a weight that most fail to notice, not because it is empty, but because it is full of possibility. It is the quiet space where thought, observation, and restraint converge, creating a presence that is felt without being announced. The world often misinterprets silence as uncertainty, as weakness, or as indecision, and in that misreading lies its subtle power. Most people rush to fill gaps in conversation, to respond before reflection, to assert presence through volume or immediate action. In doing so, they surrender control, allowing momentum to shift toward the loudest or most impulsive, handing over influence without realizing it. But when you pause deliberately, when you allow the interval to exist and breathe, you establish a rhythm not dictated by others, and in that measured stillness, the dynamics of engagement quietly begin to shift. The silence does not command with force. It commands by presence, and presence, when it is calm and unwavering, communicates authority more effectively than speech ever could. It is a subtle language, understood instinctively by those attuned to patterns of response, and it requires no drama, no overt display, only disciplined attention and observation. By choosing silence, you create a reflective mirror in which others reveal themselves, often more fully than they intend. Their words stretch to fill the empty space, their gestures become amplified, and their anxieties or intentions emerge almost unbidden. In those moments, every over-explained justification, every hurried clarification, every unconscious reveal becomes a source of insight, a guide to understanding where leverage has previously existed. The Stoics referred to this practice as assent to impressions with judgment, observing that the mind is sovereign only when it decides which external signals to accept and which to let pass. Silence allows you to receive impressions without granting them automatic authority over your state. As Marcus Aurelius wrote, "If it is not right, do not do it. If it is not true, do not say it." By holding this space, you become the still center in a world of motion, the point of stability around which others orient themselves. The pause, when wielded with intention, becomes a subtle but profound form of influence, shaping interactions not by overt action, but by the quiet power of measured inaction. It demonstrates that the mind can be present without being compelled, observant without being drawn into reactive currents. The strategic nature of silence becomes increasingly clear in social and professional contexts. When a point is made, a challenge posed, or a confrontation begins, the immediate impulse is to defend, to justify, or to assert. Yet the momentary restraint, the calm interval before speaking, changes everything. The other party begins to interpret the lack of response through their own expectations, often filling it with anxiety or second-guessing. Their attempts to provoke a reaction or elicit affirmation expand, sometimes revealing motives, intentions, or weaknesses that would have remained hidden had the silence not been maintained. Each measured pause becomes a lens through which the world is refracted, revealing subtleties that are otherwise invisible in the rush of conversation. By learning to hold this silence without compulsion, you create a psychological environment in which control is not seized, but naturally emerges from the clarity of your presence. Timing, in these moments, is not incidental. It is a quiet assertion of influence, a demonstration that your inner rhythm is your own, untouched by external pressures. This approach also cultivates patience, the kind that is disciplined rather than passive. Silence practiced as a tool of observation requires a steady mind, able to withstand discomfort, uncertainty, or even tension without being swayed. The impulse to fill the void, to speak first, to assert, is gradually diminished as the benefits of measured restraint become apparent. The mind grows attuned to the subtle cadence of interaction, noticing the ebb and flow of intent, emotion, and expectation. Each instance of deliberate silence reinforces an understanding that response is a choice, and that the timing of that response determines not just the immediate outcome, but the psychological dynamics that follow. The Stoics emphasized that the interval between stimulus and response is sacred, a space in which rational thought, self-command, and discernment can be exercised. Silence is the vessel in which these qualities are realized, a container that holds both reflection and subtle influence simultaneously. Even the smallest instances of maintained silence accumulate into a broader sense of authority and presence. The mind learns that not every prompt, expectation, or provocation requires engagement, and that restraint produces clarity that immediate reaction cannot. Over time, habitual silence fosters a space in which decision-making is deliberate, awareness is heightened, and interactions are guided by principle rather than compulsion. The unobserved observer gradually becomes a force in the environment, demonstrating that influence and composure are inseparable from the ability to hold space for reflection. The Stoics recognized that power is less about exertion and more about presence, less about noise and more about steady equilibrium. Silence, in its deliberate practice, is the embodiment of this principle, allowing the individual to navigate the currents of life with intentionality and poise. Ultimately, the practice of silence reshapes the understanding of control itself. The individual who observes without immediate reaction establishes a psychological foothold in any interaction. Timing, attention, and perception become the instruments through which influence is exerted. By holding space, one allows the external world to reveal itself while preserving sovereignty over the inner state. Each instance of measured restraint strengthens a pattern of self-mastery in which calm is habitual, clarity is cultivated, and influence emerges naturally. The mind that masters silence transforms ordinary interactions into exercises in strategic presence, turning potential vulnerability into subtle strength. The rhythm of engagement is no longer dictated by external expectations. It is guided by deliberate choice, anchored in reason, and sustained by disciplined observation. In this stillness, authority is realized quietly but unmistakably, forming the foundation for deeper composure and unwavering presence. Introducing deliberate variance requires a mindful approach, not randomness. It is not the creation of chaos nor a rejection of consistency, but a disciplined practice of flexibility and unpredictability within the bounds of principle. The Stoics advised being like the river, consistent in essence, yet fluid in form. Your values, intentions, and priorities remain stable, yet the ways in which you express them, the timing of your actions, and the rhythm of your responses are intentionally varied. Sometimes you respond immediately, sometimes you allow a pause, sometimes warmth is extended openly, and other times your reserve is maintained. Each instance of conscious variance subtly disrupts the patterns others rely upon, forcing them to recalibrate, to reassess, and to approach you with caution rather than assumption. As Epictetus observed, it's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. This unpredictability is a protective mechanism, preserving mental space and sovereignty. It communicates that while you are engaged, present, and consistent in principle, you are not a predictable instrument to be played. By becoming unreadable, you shield yourself from undue influence and establish a quiet authority that does not need to be announced. The very act of controlling predictability becomes an exercise in self-mastery, reflecting the Stoic belief that freedom and power arise from the governance of one's own mind and actions rather than from the manipulation of external circumstances. Deliberate variation also reshapes internal perception. By consistently resisting the pull of predictable response, the mind becomes less reactive, more measured, and increasingly capable of observing its own impulses without immediate surrender. This self-awareness is at the heart of Stoic discipline, to act from reason rather than compulsion, to allow patterns of thought and behavior to be informed by principle rather than habit. The individual learns to discern which impulses are worth expression and which are better held in reserve. In doing so, mental and emotional energy is preserved and interactions gain depth and intentionality. The simple act of introducing subtle unpredictability cultivates a landscape of observation, reflection, and choice, reinforcing both inner autonomy and outward influence. Each measured variation compounds over time, building a reputation of steadiness and discernment while maintaining the flexibility that prevents exploitation. The protective and influential aspects of pattern disruption are inseparable. By becoming less predictable, the individual safeguards against manipulation, while simultaneously establishing a presence that commands attention and respect. Observers are forced to engage with substance rather than assumption, to recognize the thoughtfulness underpinning behavior rather than relying on reflexive expectation. This quiet mastery is both defensive and generative. It shields the mind from undue influence, and it fosters an environment in which interactions are more deliberate, considered, and principled. The Stoics emphasized the cultivation of self-governance as the cornerstone of freedom, and deliberate variation in behavior is a practical application of this principle, ensuring that the mind is neither enslaved to habit nor vulnerable to exploitation. Presence becomes a tool of influence, subtle but undeniable, emerging from the consistent application of intentional unpredictability. Over time, the practice transforms social dynamics and self-perception. The mind that governs its own patterns develops confidence, resilience, and clarity. Engagement becomes deliberate, interaction intentional, and influence arises naturally from the perception of careful, thoughtful behavior, rather than from coercion or force. Predictability, once a leash, is replaced by autonomy. Control, once ceded to expectation, is reclaimed through subtlety and awareness. Each conscious decision to vary response reinforces self-mastery and the quiet power that emerges from disciplined presence. The individual moves through life with steady influence, navigating relationships and interactions with thoughtful adaptability, maintaining composure and shaping outcomes through the deliberate management of patterns. Respect grows not from volume or force, but from the unmistakable stability and intentionality of behavior. In mastering patterns and introducing conscious variance, the mind asserts its sovereignty, cultivates resilience, and transforms ordinary interaction into a landscape of subtle authority, demonstrating that true influence and freedom emerge from disciplined, intentional engagement rather than from reactive predictability. Attention is one of the subtlest forms of influence, yet it is also one of the most powerful because it carries both energy and presence wherever it goes. Every glance, every listening ear, every moment of focus conveys value beyond words, signaling importance and shaping perception in ways often overlooked. Yet in the modern rhythm of constant connectivity and perpetual engagement, attention is squandered, scattered across distractions, obligations, and incessant social demands. The mind becomes a conduit for external stimuli, flowing freely without discernment, and in doing so, the individual diminishes the implicit weight of presence. The Stoics understood that what is given too freely loses its significance, and that the power of attention, like any finite resource, is magnified when it is deliberate, measured, and thoughtfully directed. The more attention is assumed, expected, or unconsciously distributed, the less it signals. The act of being present without restraint becomes commonplace, predictable, and easily taken for granted, while the true potency of influence lies in intentionality, in knowing when to engage and when to withdraw. Each moment in which attention is consciously withheld becomes an assertion of autonomy, an affirmation that your energy and presence are not obligations, but choices. This deliberate calibration of focus transforms ordinary engagement into an instrument of subtle authority, in which the unspoken communication of value far outweighs overt demonstration. When availability is treated as infinite, it communicates a vulnerability few recognize. By responding instantly to every message, attending every call, and yielding to every expectation, a subtle dependency forms. The environment begins to assume that your presence is continuous, your attention guaranteed. This assumption weakens influence because it removes discretion, the very factor that transforms engagement into significance. When you step back, when moments of attention are intentionally measured, scarcity imbues presence with weight. Others notice the difference without consciously articulating it. They adjust their own behaviors to align with this new rhythm, responding with heightened consideration, greater thoughtfulness, and a renewed awareness of what was once taken for granted. The mind, trained to honor the finite nature of focus, begins to operate strategically, allocating energy to interactions, decisions, and engagements that align with principle rather than compulsion. The withdrawal of attention is not a withdrawal from life or connection, but a disciplined act that reestablishes boundaries, preserves clarity, and elevates the value of participation. Through this practice, presence is no longer an undifferentiated constant. It becomes a tool of influence and an anchor for personal sovereignty. The psychological dynamics of attention are subtle yet profound. Human perception responds instinctively to scarcity. The rare is noticed, The constant fades into the background. When attention is abundant and freely given, it ceases to convey distinct meaning. But when attention is calibrated, measured, and aligned with intention, it commands consideration without demand. The Stoics emphasized that external conditions should not dictate internal equilibrium, and this principle extends directly to how presence is offered. By consciously controlling the flow of attention, the mind becomes a stabilizing force, capable of guiding interactions without manipulation or coercion. Each selective moment of engagement signals value and encourages respect, not through assertion of authority, but through the quiet clarity of intentionality. This subtlety is the essence of disciplined influence. The mind that measures its presence, that conserves attention, becomes inherently compelling. Others respond to the conscious rhythm established, not because they are forced, but because the patterns they once relied upon no longer hold, and the scarcity of deliberate focus creates a natural pull toward consideration and awareness. Even ordinary interactions are transformed when attention is treated as a finite and meaningful resource. Casual conversations, professional meetings, and everyday encounters take on heightened significance when engagement is intentional. By calibrating presence, the mind preserves cognitive and emotional energy, focusing it where it is most valuable while allowing peripheral interactions to occur without overinvestment. The impact of this practice accumulates over time. The individual becomes recognized as deliberate, thoughtful, and measured. Presence itself communicates competence, authority, and emotional intelligence, even without overt declaration. When others notice that their attempts to command attention are met with measured availability, a subtle psychological shift occurs. Expectation is disrupted, assumptions are challenged, and interactions are guided by a newfound equilibrium. This practice cultivates both autonomy and influence simultaneously, reflecting the Stoic principle that mastery of the self produces mastery over circumstances, not through dominance, but through strategic engagement and disciplined presence. Attention, when withheld strategically, also cultivates discernment. Each pause, each delayed response, and each moment of quiet observation allows the mind to assess the situation without the pressure of immediate engagement. The Stoics taught that clarity of judgment is best achieved in a calm and deliberate state, free from the impulsive pull of emotion or compulsion. By treating attention as a resource rather than a reflex, the mind develops an enhanced capacity to prioritize, to allocate energy where it is most impactful, and to act with precision rather than habit. This approach cultivates internal resilience. The mind becomes less reactive to provocation, more capable of measured response, and increasingly adept at navigating social and environmental dynamics. The deliberate management of attention is not withdrawal in the sense of disengagement. It is a disciplined calibration that magnifies influence, reinforces autonomy, and maintains equilibrium. In each instance, the mind exercises sovereignty over focus, subtly shaping outcomes without overt exertion, and establishing patterns of interaction that are sustainable, deliberate, and strategically advantageous. The effect extends beyond immediate interactions into broader patterns of personal conduct. By consistently regulating the availability of attention, the individual cultivates an inner framework of self-governance, where priorities are respected, energy is preserved, and influence is exercised without overt effort. Others adapt to this presence, learning to value engagement, and the pattern of interaction evolves naturally. The perception of intentionality communicates reliability, thoughtfulness, and deliberate judgment. Over time, the accumulation of these moments establishes a reputation for measured engagement, where the mind's focus is recognized as a resource that commands consideration rather than being assumed. This subtle authority, cultivated through disciplined management of attention, demonstrates that power is not created through volume or coercion, but through strategic presence, deliberate allocation of energy, and the quiet assertion of autonomy. It reflects the Stoic understanding that the mind governs experience and that influence derives from composure, clarity, and conscious participation. The practice also reveals the relationship between attention and self-worth. When the mind treats its focus as a resource to be allocated with intention, it reinforces a sense of value and agency. Others' demands no longer dictate the tempo or quality of engagement. Internal standards replace external pressure, and the individual's sense of importance is grounded in discipline rather than approval. This creates a psychological resilience that supports thoughtful action across diverse circumstances, from professional collaboration to personal relationships. The Stoics emphasized that self-governance and inner contentment are cultivated through mastery over perception and intention rather than through the accumulation of external validation. By treating attention as finite and deliberate, the individual embodies this principle in daily practice, reinforcing autonomy while fostering respect naturally without assertion or coercion. Over time, the cumulative effect of measured attention shapes both the individual and their environment. Each conscious pause, each deliberate moment of presence, reinforces a pattern of interaction in which engagement is meaningful, influence is subtle yet powerful, and autonomy is maintained. The individual's inner life remains unshaken by external demand, while the external world adjusts to the clarity, consistency, and deliberation of their presence. The mind becomes a stabilizing force in the midst of distraction, a quiet authority recognized and respected by those who perceive it. Scarcity of attention, when applied thoughtfully, transforms ordinary interactions into arenas of intentional influence, reinforcing the Stoic principle that mastery of self is the foundation for mastery of circumstances. Presence, when measured, communicates power without words, authority without assertion, and influence without demand, creating a life in which every engagement is guided by deliberate choice and disciplined awareness. The understanding of attention as currency is thus both protective and generative. It shields the mind from the erosion of constant availability, preserves energy for what truly matters, and cultivates subtle, natural influence in interactions. By exercising restraint, the mind communicates value through its own comportment rather than through external signals. Each interaction becomes a reflection of internal sovereignty, a demonstration of deliberate presence, and a testament to the efficacy of disciplined attention. Over time, these repeated acts cultivate an environment in which respect is earned, influence is observed, and engagement is intentionally weighted, reflecting the Stoic principle that internal mastery produces external coherence. Presence, when offered intentionally, becomes more than mere participation. It becomes a channel of influence, a vehicle of authority, and a foundation for measured, thoughtful, and unshakable engagement with the world. Through the conscious allocation of attention, autonomy, presence, and influence are strengthened simultaneously. Each interaction is an opportunity to reinforce the sovereignty of the mind, to preserve clarity, and to communicate value without assertion or demand. The disciplined use of attention ensures that engagement is deliberate, influence arises organically, and the individual remains unshaken by external pressures. By treating attention as a finite, purposeful resource, the mind cultivates both personal resilience and subtle authority, aligning with the Stoic principle that true power emerges from mastery over one's own focus, choices, and presence, rather than from the uncontrolled expectations of others. In this practice, attention becomes a tool, a shield, and a currency of influence, demonstrating that calm, deliberate, and intentional engagement transforms ordinary interaction into a landscape of quiet yet profound authority. Immediate reactions carry an illusion of power. The swift response is often mistaken for decisiveness, yet it frequently betrays an attachment to the moment, a dependence on events unfolding exactly as they arrive. Acting first signals that the mind is tethered to stimuli, swayed by their urgency rather than governed by deliberate intent. The Stoics recognized the danger in this reflexive engagement, emphasizing the space between stimulus and response as the true domain of choice. As Marcus Aurelius wrote, "If you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it, and this you have the power to revoke at any moment. It is in that interval that reason can intervene, shaping action according to principle rather than impulse, and guiding conduct with measured attention. By introducing a deliberate pause, by resisting the compulsion to answer immediately, the individual asserts a quiet authority, shifting the rhythm of interaction away from external pressures and toward internal mastery. Each breath taken before a response is a subtle recalibration of influence, signaling that the mind is not hurried, that it is not compelled by the immediacy of circumstance, and that the flow of events does not dictate the flow of thought. In that stillness, clarity emerges, and the power of deliberate timing replaces the illusion of hasty force. The effect of delayed response is both psychological and relational. When others encounter the restraint of measured timing, their expectations are disrupted. The urgency that once drove interaction shifts, subtly repositioning control. In conversations where provocation is intended to elicit immediate reaction, the pause denies the expected leverage, and the instigator is forced to confront uncertainty. Their assumptions about predictability no longer hold, and the pause itself becomes a silent demonstration of presence and discipline. The Stoics viewed such restraint as an exercise in self-command, where autonomy is exercised not through confrontation or force, but through the careful orchestration of one's own responses. Each moment of hesitation, each choice to reflect before acting, establishes a rhythm in which influence flows from deliberate action rather than reaction, and the individual becomes a stabilizing force, capable of directing the emotional tone of interaction without engaging in unnecessary conflict. It is a quiet mastery that communicates authority subtly yet unmistakably, shaping the environment without coercion. Pausing before action also deepens awareness. When the immediate urge to respond is restrained, the mind gains space to assess the situation, evaluate the motives of others, and consider the long-term consequences of words and deeds. This space transforms interaction from a reactive exchange into a thoughtful negotiation of presence and intention. The Stoics referred to this as discerning what is within one's control and what is not, recognizing that clarity emerges when the mind refuses to be rushed by external events. Every delayed response becomes a deliberate choice, reinforcing the internal structure of decision-making. By consistently practicing this restraint, the mind develops a heightened capacity for judgment, able to discern nuance and maintain composure in situations that would otherwise provoke impulsive or emotionally driven action. The pause transforms perception, allowing the individual to engage with precision, intentionality, and awareness, rather than being carried along by external pressure. The transformative power of timing extends beyond immediate exchanges. By controlling when a response is delivered, the individual governs not only the tone, but the emotional trajectory of an interaction. Urgency, agitation, or expectation that once defined the pace of exchange is redirected. The other party, accustomed to instant feedback, experiences the absence of automatic reaction as a subtle recalibration of influence. In this adjustment, control shifts naturally, not through confrontation or force, but through the disciplined management of temporal dynamics. The mind, freed from the tyranny of reflexive engagement, maintains equilibrium, while the external world aligns, often unconsciously, to the measured pace set by deliberate choice. The rhythm of interaction, once dictated by external stimulus, is now informed by the individual's judgment, allowing engagement to occur under the terms of reasoned thought rather than instinctive compulsion. This approach also reinforces emotional resilience. Reacting immediately binds the mind to the fluctuations of circumstance, amplifying the effect of provocation and extending the influence of others over one's internal state. By delaying response, the individual exercises agency over the emotional impact of events, creating a buffer between external stimulus and internal experience. The pause allows for reflection, the tempering of impulse, and the application of principle to action. In this space, the mind experiences freedom from the automaticity of reaction, establishing a consistent baseline of composure. The Stoics taught that serenity is cultivated through mastery over perception and action, not through avoidance or suppression. Each intentional delay strengthens the capacity for calm, measured engagement, creating an enduring foundation of self-governance that influences behavior across contexts, relationships, and challenges. Over time, the habitual practice of measured response transforms habitual patterns of thought and behavior. The individual learns to observe impulses without being compelled to act upon them, to distinguish between what demands immediate attention and what benefits from reflection, and to cultivate patience as a tool of strategic influence. Deliberate timing becomes a vehicle for presence, a method of shaping outcomes through careful orchestration rather than force. The psychological weight of immediate provocation diminishes, replaced by a measured engagement in which responses are guided by clarity and principle. Those who encounter this disciplined approach to timing recognize, consciously or unconsciously, the shift in control. Influence is no longer granted to those who can provoke quick reaction, but to the individual who governs the tempo of interaction with deliberation and insight. This discipline also fosters internal clarity and strengthens judgment. Each pause allows the mind to prioritize reasoning over reflex, to evaluate context, intention, and consequence before committing energy to action. The practice builds discernment, revealing which exchanges merit attention and which can be navigated with restraint. By exercising control over timing, the individual preserves cognitive and emotional resources, avoiding the depletion caused by reactive engagement. Presence becomes intentional, and each interaction is guided by principle rather than compulsion. This disciplined approach reinforces autonomy, allowing influence to emerge from deliberate action and the careful calibration of engagement rather than from urgency or external pressure. The Stoics valued such control, recognizing that the interval between stimulus and response is where freedom and choice reside. Delaying response also strengthens subtle authority. The mind that governs its timing exerts influence without overt assertion. The external world, accustomed to immediate compliance or reaction, must adjust to a new rhythm. Expectations are recalibrated, assumptions tested, and the psychological balance of interactions subtly shifts. By maintaining a deliberate interval before response, the individual becomes a stabilizing presence, capable of directing emotional currents, managing perception, and guiding the flow of dialogue. This measured authority is recognized not through declaration, but through consistent practice, and it transforms ordinary engagement into a demonstration of disciplined influence. Timing, once overlooked, becomes a medium of mastery, shaping outcomes and perceptions with precision and calm. The implications extend across professional, social, and personal dimensions. Immediate reactions often compound misunderstanding, escalate tension, and create unnecessary vulnerability. By introducing deliberate pause, each interaction is approached with thoughtful consideration. Negotiations are conducted with strategic clarity, conflicts are navigated with tempered judgment, and communication becomes an instrument of calm influence. The rhythm of engagement is consciously managed, and the individual's presence carries weight without overt assertion. Authority emerges from the measured interval, from the careful calibration of timing, and from the consistent exercise of judgment. Influence is therefore grounded in reasoned restraint, and the mind maintains sovereignty over both internal and external currents. Ultimately, the disciplined use of pause is a form of self-governance that manifests in every interaction. Each delayed response reinforces composure, cultivates autonomy, and strengthens the ability to engage from a position of clarity rather than reflex. The mind that exercises restraint in timing becomes a center of quiet authority, shaping perception, guiding interaction, and preserving internal equilibrium. The Stoics emphasized that mastery of the self is the foundation for mastery over circumstance, and deliberate response embodies this principle in action. Timing, once overlooked, becomes the instrument through which influence, presence, and authority are exercised, creating a life in which actions are guided by principle, reflections are informed by reason, and engagement occurs on terms determined by choice rather than compulsion. Remember this: true strength is quiet, calm, and unshakable. It lives in the mind that observes without surrender, acts without attachment, and holds presence as a choice rather than a reaction. Every moment you step into that space, you reclaim a piece of freedom that no one can take from you. You are no longer moved without consent, no longer manipulated, and no longer caught off guard. Carry this clarity forward, and let your presence shape the world around you with deliberate calm. If you want to deepen this practice, click on one of the suggested videos on the screen and continue exploring the principles that strengthen inner mastery and Stoic presence. Thank you for being part of Stoic Journal and for choosing to cultivate a mind that is truly unshakable.